So we all love a good Hans Niemann update, right? And he's been recently playing in the Kazakhstan Cup, a classical open chess tournament which was played down the road from the World Championship and at a similar time frame. So I'll reveal how Hans did overall in the tournament towards the end of the video, but first I want to show you this round 2 game. He played it against a FIDE master going by the name of Abilmansur Abdilkhair, and this is just a fascinating game. Real squeaky bum time for Hans Niemann. Now, if you're not from the UK, you won't be familiar with squeaky bum time, right? The best way to describe this phrase is just by showing you the game here and all will be revealed. So let's have a look at what happened. Hans with black, his opponent with white kicks off with e4. So we see a Sicilian, very common when you've got a huge rating difference, you immediately try and imbalance things. We now see knight f3, d6, an open Sicilian. We get these standard opening moves and all 4 knights developing onto the board. Bishop g5 now played, the mainline move. We get e6, the Scandinavian pawn structure. We see queen d2, preparing castles queenside, and a6 from Hans, preparing the classic queenside expansion. Castles queenside played. Bishop d7 now flicked in, and f4 from white. Really standard ideas. You're about to get attacked on the queen side, so you look for play in the centre. We now see bishop e7, and the knight drops back to f3, a kind of underdeveloping move, but it opens up the queen and rook, and so after Hans goes b5, well, now you can chop on f6, and the bishop can't recapture, or you lose this pawn. So the pawn recaptures instead. So black's got the bishop pair, yes, but you've ruined the pawn structure and the king could be a bit drafty in future. So king b1 now from white, b4 on the board. The knight doesn't come to a4, by the way, or you're in the line of the bishop, not a good square. So it jumps back to e2, and now great move by Niemann. So if you go queen b6, a classic attacking idea that we see him do in a moment, well then after f5, e5, the problem is that the white queen can invade and sit on this square. So compare this to the game. Hans now plays the best move in the position, pawn to h5. No more queen move ideas. And you expand here, you make it more difficult for g4 to come, and the king is safe enough for the time being, enclosed by that whole cluster of pawns. So f5 now from white. Now we see the immediate e5 played, which is the best move. You don't want to allow this knight to hop to f4, start pressuring things, and then if you go e5, well, the knight could hit d5. So instead, e5 on the board, and now knight c1, good move. You know, that knight didn't have any future from this square, and so it also now opens the bishop to develop into the game. We see queen b6, bishop c4, white going for a light squared strategy, rook c8 played, and now the FM opponent, who's done so well so far, just blinks. So the best move is queen e2. You cover the bishop from the x-ray of the rook, also pressure this pawn, and therefore stop knight d4, which we see in the game. You know, that can simply be captured with a bad pawn structure for black. Compare that to the game, we see knight b3, but now knight d4 comes. Great move from Hans. And the idea being, if you take, well, black picks up the bishop, good attack about to come on the board. So what do we see instead? Well, the queen covers the bishop, the move that should have been played sooner, but now knight b5. And so in the space of 2 moves, Hans has drastically improved this knight. He's opened his bishop, his rook's opened, you know, activated tons of pieces. He's now better. Queen e2 played, so looking to lift the rook into the d5 square. a5 on the board, rook d5, and now rook b8 covers the knight, and we get rook h to d1, doubling on the file. So Hans goes bishop c6, looks to evict that rook, and there was a really nice exchange sack idea here for white actually. You can drop back with this one, offer that piece, and then look to go knight c4. Gives black still a small advantage, but really nice idea if black captures. But what we see in the game is bishop takes on b5, not such a bad move, but that's a bit of a monster bishop now on the light squares. The queen retreats to e1. We get a4, kicking this knight back, and now a3. And white's really hesitant here to go b3, weaken all the dark squares, and not even be able to attack one of these pawns. So what they play instead is captures on a3, pawn recaptures, looks so scary opening up the b file, but after king a1 there's not an immediate knockout blow. So Hans starts with queen c6, threatening to check from c3, so we get that one blocked by the queen, and now this is good play from Hans. He takes a moment to castle the king. If you get too hasty, say you capture this pawn, then the problem is rook b1 comes, covers the mate, and also starts pressuring this bishop in a really nasty way, plus it's pinned to the rook. And this pawn could drop soon. So I won't start clicking through all the lines here. Black is still a little bit better, but white starts getting quite a lot of pressure actually and can really start counter-attacking. So the pawn not captured, castle's played, knight e1 now played to cover that pawn, rook fc8 from Hans, and rook b1 challenging that really dangerous file, also pressuring the bishop. So it drops back to a6 and rook b3. Very logical idea. You never want to take here as black because you help repair the pawn structure and things like c4 could be coming very soon. So instead, Hans goes bishop d8. Another good move there, by the way. Sorry, bishop f8. Another good move was bishop d8, swinging around like this actually. Way more active plan. Would have been better. But okay, he keeps advantage, and now white picks up this a-pawn. Hans could never really defend that, so he's always playing for compensation for that pawn in the form of an attack. And now with the bishop pressured here, it's interesting that Hans decides to give it up. He goes bishop c4 and allows the knight to capture. And I was doing some clicking around, seeing if he could hold on to his bishop pair, but there was always problems with the second rook doubling, attacking it, and it kind of started to stand in the way of the heavy pieces. So that's why he gives up. Bishop for knight. Rook d to d3 now played. Really good stuff from white so far in this game. Way outranked, but holding their own. Now d5 from Hans. The opportunity given to open the board. And this is what this rook move allowed. It wasn't forced. But there is this sequence. So white now wants to just start chasing Hans' queen around, try and force some kind of repetition. And when you run it with the engine wants to keep just moving that queen all over the board. But what does Hans do? He takes on e4. Not the top move as you can see, but he wants to keep the game alive. So the pawn recaptures, rook g3 check now played, king h7, and the rook slides back to e3. And this is a dangerous endgame now for Hans. I mean, you can't defend this pawn. Say you try something like this, well then the simply rook takes on b8. You can't leave that rook. And if you capture first, you repair the pawns and you cover the square, so you still can't lift to defend the pawn. So instead, the king comes up, threatens to invade. White takes a timeout, blocks the entry point. Now we get rook a8. This rook captures on e4, and now we get the preparation of doubling the rooks. c3 played, more good chess, preparing a square for the knight. Now the rook doubles, rook b2, it gets hit by the bishop, but after rook b3, you don't have to cover anymore, the rook blocks the file. We see this one drop back, rook b2, bishop a3. Are we going to see repetition? Well, no. Hans wants to keep the game alive. He brings his rook down to that open d file. Knight c2 played. Now it looks impossible, but actually this check is not so scary. You just block, nothing else to be done but retreat this bishop soon or swap rooks, and nothing wrong there for white. So instead, bishop c1 played, g3 now played, stopping the bishop from ever sitting on this square. And now Hans goes king to g7, prophylactic chess against this threat of rook e1. He's given his bishop a retreat square. Knight b4 hits this rook, it drops back to a8, and we now get rook e2, covering the second rank. And this is dangerous for black, because Hans is a pawn down, plus these two are doubled, and both of these are passed pawns. So king h7 played, king b2, rook d1, now we see the pawn march on to c4. Rook c8 comes in front and rook c2 comes behind that pawn. And this is squeaky bum time for Hans Niemann, right? So if you want to know what squeaky bum time means, I mean, as I said, you'll kind of see it in the game. But I'm changing tabs here. Hopefully you can kind of see this okay. But as you can see, it's kind of the tense final stages of a competition. You know, it kind of gets said in soccer as well and things, or football as we say in the UK. But it's the final tense closing stages, squeaky bum time. So Hans, he's trying to hold on against an FM. He's a super GM. So he goes bishop to f8. Good move. Stops the pawn advancing. We now see knight d5. The king covers the f6 pawn. a4 on the board. Now a4 not forced, by the way. I was looking at things like rook b5 and slow playing the position. You can do that, but then black can potentially check if you ever march the king to b3. You know, there are drawing mechanisms. White could have slow played though to keep some pressure. But a4 on the board. Now bishop c5 comes, a5, and here Hans has really activated that dart squared bishop. Whoops, didn't mean to click. Now if you go king a2, you're actually getting mated in one. So that's why we see king a3, but now check comes anyway, and if you go king b4, trying to hold the pawn, well, this rook can come and you're picking up that pawn by force. So instead, this rook blocks. We see these ones exchanged. This pawn now drops, but still, the a pawn is running. It's so dangerous. We get rook c1, threatening mate. Rook a3 covers, and now bishop a7 stops the advance of that pawn, but knight c3 is a great move, threatening knight b5 to win the bishop or push the pawn. What is Hans going to do here? Now the top engine move is rook f1, just abandoning the bishop, going after the f pawn. Hans goes bishop c5, attacking the rook, and white had a great move here. Now can you guess what the best move here for white to play is to keep a significant advantage? So the best way to play is ignore the attack on the rook and go king b3. You can't actually take that one, or the pawn just starts marching through, and this is much better for white. But what we see in the game here is knight to a4. This is a blunder. So the bishop now takes the rook. Hans leaves the protection of this square and allows the pawn to advance. This looks impossible, but he's seen deeper in the time trouble. So the rook now drops back, covers the square, knight b6, hits the rook. It looks like this should be completely winning for white after the king captures here, but this is the problem. Pawn to e4 on the board, and here we see resignation. Now the king is completely cut. If you march it over, well, you're just not going to get anywhere. So you have to at some point queen this pawn, but then the rook gives itself up, and black actually queens. You're just one tempo short as white. That's why it's game over. So Hans almost loses to an FM, but just holds on. Hence, squeaky bum time for Hans Niemann. Now the final results of the competition can be seen on screen here. Hans Niemann finished 6th. He got 7 points with a number of other players, but 2 players stood out in front on 7.5. Thanks very much for watching, and see another epic game. Check out the video on screen. See you soon.